Like
20.
anyone else, we're excited to talk about culture committees today, especially as we are going into the summer because we can just have so much impact. We appreciate everybody joining. Can't wait to hear about some of those trips. Oh yeah, Shelly's in Texas. Come on Thursday. So exciting. As those kids continue to roll in, please do use the chat box. We have a Q&A box. Put in your questions. We're going to do our best to answer them during our time today, at the end, or in follow-ups. We want to hear from you. A recording of this presentation will be sent after the call, as well as a copy of the deck. If you do have to leave early, we'll also have it on demand for you to review and share with anyone on your team. But yeah, we'll go ahead and probably get started here. And of course, regardless if we're counting down summer days or days to summer break or a trip, we just hope everybody has a great end of the month leading into the holiday, especially here in the States. And we're excited for you to be with us today. So we'll go ahead and we'll get started. If you were part of our webinar, it's been a couple months now, Corey. We're back, same dynamic duo here. My name is Bree Mouton, like the cheese and wine, so easy to remember. And you may have learned that I've been a part of the Limeade listening team coming up on 2.5 years now. And I am one of our customer success managers working with our client accounts on employee feedback, engagement, and culture strategies while using our listening tool. And I'm lucky enough, when I first joined our Tiny Pulse team, I was nominated as a culture committee member for a period of time and got to experience a lot of what we're reviewing today. But I'm excited to continue this discussion and dive more into culture committees. And I'm excited to welcome back my colleague, Corey, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, Bree. Thank you so much for the gracious introduction. As always, my name is Corey Tanaka. In July, I'll be 5 years here with Tiny Pulse, now Limeade Listening. And in that 5 years, I've spent many times in the Culture Committee in addressing different issues and understanding really what's going to be the most impactful items for our people. And really what are people needing and asking for the most right now. Right now, I'm embodying a sales enablement specialist role. And it's been really interesting as well, seeing this sort of intersection of our culture and how these also can play out in my day-to-day tasks as well. But let's get into our agenda today. Perfect. All right. As we start to review the agenda today, you're going to see a 2-question quick poll come up as well. Question number 1 is going to be, did you attend or watch on demand our first part 1 for Culture Committee webinar? And then the second question is, do you have a Culture Committee active in your organization? Would love to get some of that feedback, but as we promised, we'll go over some of the agenda first as you're responding to that poll. So first off, we'll lead up our webinar with reviewing some of the findings and takeaways from part 1. And then we'll go into the real meat of the discussion here. Really, what does your culture committee do? How can they cooperate amongst each other, as well as amongst the organization with leadership and communicate back to everyone as well? And then what sort of workflows and action items can they have? And then lastly, the most exciting part, what does the evolution of that culture committee really look like? And just a friendly reminder, the deck and the recording are going to be available after the webinar today. And also we have a packet of resources to help you get started as well with your culture committee. Oh, and we're seeing those results come in now. Oh, almost a 50-50 split on attendees, and a 53% of attendees today have a culture committee active. That's amazing. Love to see that, but very, very excited to see that 37% no, as well as 10% I'm not sure, because hey, we'll try and help you figure that out by the end of this call as well. Bree, anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, no, awesome. I love to see the mix. I think that goes very nicely into our review of part 1 and what we're going to take a look at here. And before we start jumping into that, just a quick refresher on that part 1 webinar. So for those that attended, great. For those that are new, we know that many companies have lots of committees. They may be focused on wellness, employee resources, maybe even a culture committee in some instances. But we want to remind everyone and kind of be clear on how we define culture here at Limeade Listening, which is a group of team members that will review feedback and/or suggestions on a regular cadence to distill themes, insights, and action items for the organization to act upon and communicate results back to the employee. Right? We know that culture committees can help amplify connectiveness at an organization, that culture committees can serve as a form of leadership and a safe space where anyone can bring up issues. Since the culture committee oftentimes also meets with leadership, employees can remain anonymous, but still know that their issues are being addressed, right? They can also be helpful in bridging those gaps across teams, employee types, even levels of management. And don't forget, they can be champions in initiating and talking about new programs or items going on, even providing some unique insights or solutions to what might work, and ultimately helping with cross-team collaboration.
Yeah. And as we're continuing to review part one, right, we also presented a couple of easy questions to ask yourself to understand, hey, would I actually benefit from a culture committee? If you answer yes to two or more, you definitely benefit from creating a culture committee and seeing the amount of folks that are here that already have a culture committee, and even those that don't. This is a very helpful sort of question to ask yourself to understand, should we continue to do this, or also should we look to implement this right now? If you're thinking about this sort of in the 5 W's perspective, like a who, what, where, when, and why sort of area, part one really took care of going over the what of a culture committee, why we're doing this, and who should be involved. And as for today, we'll be going over the implementation and work of a culture committee, really the when and how. All right, Bree, anything you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, I think this is really the exciting part, right? We've already got our buy-in, we've determined our committee size or the service length, how leadership will actually be involved, and maybe what that recruitment can look like. So as Corey mentioned, it's time to implement that committee. So our next steps, now that we have kind of that structure, is to notify the organization and our team members of their nomination or invite to be part of the committee, and then confirm their participation. You'll see here when you receive the deck, we have a couple of takeaway resources for you in some templates on how we can initiate those conversations, what that's going to be looking like on that invite email side, as well as that email confirmation. Once you received that buy-in from those committee members and we have allocated out what our schedule is going to look like, it's really important to introduce this culture committee to the entire organization. It helps provide transparency on who's the committee and who's being reviewing feedback and what's going to be actioned out. Now, you can always have fun with this, right? An email goes a long way, or introducing at a company meeting. But some of our clients, Big Red Rooster Flow, who really prides themselves on fun and really uplifting and amplifying their culture, loves to create videos. So last year, this was a video that they created to introduce their new culture committee. Let's take a look. Awesome. Well, hopefully you picked up on some of the hints that this had a friend theme with it. There was some music going there. This was something that they shared with the team and really identified who those committees were, right? You want to have those avenues so people know who to go to. Thank you to Kathy Dunn and her team. She's the Senior VP of People Operations for sharing that with us. And now that everybody knows who's on the committee, right, we can't forget to do that. Now it's time to get to work. And we're going to focus on those cadences and workflows. So the main goal of any culture committee is to understand and improve on what's affecting your work environment and culture. Every committee is going to be reviewing, discussing, and acting upon the feedback and the data that they're receiving. We know, depending on organizational size or structure, industry, or even geographical location, there could be different culture committee styles. We typically see two main styles, which happen to be at the bookends, and that's what we're going to review today. The first is a focused group style. This is where leadership is really asking the culture committee to gain clarity on responses and feedback. It is more of a company-led initiative with solutions. And the workload will be completed by an admin or a leadership team. At a high level, looking at the grassroots style, we see that the culture committee is really being empowered to identify those focus areas based on the feedback received. And it's much more of an employee-driven initiative with solutions based on additional research that they have reached out to their organization with. And ultimately, with a grassroots style, it's more of a committee shared workload. So before we dive into these, it's just important to think about your committee structure and keep in mind the people and resources available as well. We typically see larger organizations utilizing the focus group style and smaller markets and teams using a grassroots approach because they're able to put action into place quicker. Before we dive more into these actual workflows, Corey, do you have anything to add?
Not necessarily anything really important to add, but just a reiteration of that. These are reflective of two ends, really, of a spectrum, really, on culture committees. Not to say that if you choose to implement a culture committee after today's call, that you're going to have to embody focus group style or grassroots style. There's going to be elements and actions, as well as timelines for each of those that best correlate to your organization. We just want to make sure that you understand really what we see as both ends of the spectrum to really find out what's going to be best for your people.
Awesome, thanks for sharing that. So we'll start off with that focus group and a timeline. This is just an at a glance of a typical timeline. And what we see here first is that main section of the review stage. This is where a survey is going out, feedback's being collected and reviewed. Leadership is really diving into the data, and as a leadership team, they're brainstorming and identifying focus areas. As we move into the discuss stage, this is where they're actually finding resolutions or identifying action steps that can then be taken to the culture committee to gain insights on what they have found and if it's going to be impactful to put into action. We want to be mindful that while this is a generic timeline, most of the focus group style is going to be seen as successful when we spend time in this review and discuss, which can take anywhere from like 30 to 90 days just in this area, right? To align, review the feedback, gain approval, which is a big part, and before we move into that act stage. Now that we're going to look a little bit more into that main point of meeting with the culture committee. All right, so based on that timeline, some of the key characteristics of a focus group culture committee meeting will be the frequency at which one has this meeting. And usually it's going to happen within the first 30 days of a survey completion or feedback received, which can translate into a quarterly cadence, right? Leadership's going to prepare for this meeting by making sure they have reviewed the latest survey results, clearly identifying themes that they have found, and start to brainstorm ideas that will help reach established goals. And we will be summarized for the culture committee. So keeping in mind this focus group is just a traditional focus group where a lot of those ideas are leadership led. Now, during the meeting with the culture committee, this information is presented and discussed, not only to gain acceptance and understanding, but see if there's any additional insights based on the feedback that received, and if it's going to articulate into the correct action and the goals moving forward. Not only do we need to think about this on an organization as a whole, but how this might affect each individual team with the action that's being taken. Culture committee members can ask questions, give input, and maybe even come up with some additional solutions based on what they have heard or offer feedback based on their experience or their team's experience. Now, finally, no matter what style you're working with, we will see similar expected outcomes with committee workflows, right? Identifying what needs to be worked on, creating those action plans, ultimately to solve any themes or issues identified within the feedback process. We also know that action paths will also look a little bit different with that focus. Now we're going to look at the grassroots style, and Corey has some experience with that, formerly here at Tiny Pulse when we were a smaller organization.
Yes, indeed. So going into a little bit more about the grassroots timeline, so we can directly compare one-to-one there, you'll see very quickly at the top, the review and discuss and act sections. The review and discuss is a little bit more condensed than the focus group style there. And so viewing each of the individual timelines, you'll also notice on the grassroots timeline, there is an extra sort of tab there. The meeting with leadership will very much be the same sort of meeting with leadership as we have just discussed in the focus group. The new meeting here would be the meeting with just the culture committee. So within a grassroots structure of a culture committee, it's viewed as a little bit quicker timeline as well. So speaking about our frequency, we could recommend at least monthly, but for the main part, it reflects your survey strategy, your survey schedule. So as soon as the survey closes, a culture committee can begin meeting. I think back to my Tiny Pulse days when we were Tiny Pulse, survey would close, and then within 3 days, we'd have our meeting as culture committee to then digest the themes and start to disseminate some of those ideas that we want to focus on for our leadership team. As we're preparing for that meeting, in a grassroots style, culture committee members would individually take the time to review their feedback, especially the feedback from their own teams as well, to really understand what's going to be the most important thing that I need to advocate for my team there. Present some ideas as well as solutions for those for those problem areas that you want to then present to the committee. Addressing that actual culture committee meeting, we'd have that open culture committee discussion around the responses. What really was flagged to us as being important items to discuss? And if it was important enough, what sort of solutions should we really discuss implementing as well and presenting to leadership? The expected outcome really from our culture committee meeting is alignment on what we need to focus on, our focus areas for engagement, as well as potential solutions to present our leadership team to then get alignment on and approval on so that we can execute on those following up our all hands meeting there. And then comparing those timelines. So with the grassroots style being able to typically enact change a lot quicker than the focus group style, you'll see direct comparisons here to each of those timelines. Not saying that one is better than the other, just showing the differences here so that you can pick and choose what's going to be best for your organization. Typically, that focus group is going to be about a quarterly cadence, a little bit of a longer timeline because there are less stakeholders involved, which creates a little bit more workload for those stakeholders as well. Because it's also very leadership, a little bit of a gatekeeping to the feedback there. It is leadership-led initiatives, which for the most part, as we've seen in our engagement data, is viewed as top-down, whereas the grassroots style is a frontline inspired solutions, while they might not be that are explicitly led by the culture committee due to different legal and HR policies that we have to abide by. Some solutions will have to be executed by leadership and HR. However, they are viewed as frontline inspired, more of a bottom-up feeling from your employees as well. Because of that committee aspect as well, there's that shared workload so that leadership is no longer forced to have to review all feedback and pull out specific themes there. Culture committee members that are parts of the teams that are feeling those issues will bring those up and also provide additional context so that you can know as a leader, this is exactly what we need to focus on. Here's what people are seeing, here's what people are feeling, and here's what we need to do. All of that staying in a much quicker timeline as well for a grassroots style. I was very much, I guess, in lack of a better word, raised in culture committees on the grassroots style or grown grassroots style. And so we've got a lot of fun anecdotes, if you will, in sort of the misalignment between culture committee and leadership. So thinking about some of the initiatives that we had worked on from a Tiny Pulse perspective in our culture committee, I think back to one specific survey that leadership came to us saying that, hey, what's going on with these low scores in effective management? Our survey at the time had shown that our effective management score had dropped down. And that's what leadership saw, which is very fair. We went into the data and also started to launch our own sort of investigation from a culture community perspective. Investigation being asking our team members, hey, what do you think about that? Like, is that true? Do you feel that way about effective management? Long story short, what we found was that our employees, our team members as well, were experiencing the same things that we were. At that time, one-on-ones were scheduled for all employees. We had 100% alignment on one-on-one scheduling. However, typically, a lot of those one-on-ones ended up being postponed or canceled by the manager request. As an employee, you get that request, you say, okay, yeah, that's fine, no issues there. However, when asked about it on a survey, we saw that that actually had the ramifications, that actually showed the data impacted by our employees there. So while the questions on our survey pointed towards effective management, our leaders started thinking about a solution in place. What sort of additional trainings would we have to send our managers to? What other tool would we have to buy for, or learning tool to buy to help our managers get better trained up? You know, what's kind of the time cost of that? We both came together, our leadership team and culture committee team came together for our discussion around those issues. And we were able to share that, hey, a lot of our people are saying that the main reason we gave those ratings on their effective management questions was because our one-on-ones aren't happening. And we want that time. We would love that one-on-one time with our manager to understand, hey, where am I falling short? Where can I find extra support on these items? What should I do in regards to X, Y, and Z? But that time and giving that time to our employees was of paramount importance. And so from that initiative, we were able to just reinforce the policy with our managers on maintaining your one-on-ones, especially if you only get them once a month or something like that with your employee, you need to keep that time. We saw a noted increase in the following quarters around effective management, namely the score of that was increased. I forget how many points. It wasn't a full point from 4 to 5 or things like that, but it was a noted increase there. But in regards to the slide, our leadership team brought up to us the issue of effective management, but we actually figured out that it was actually coming from communication there. And so our culture committee was able to hone in on what the actual issue was and what a actually impactful low-cost strategy solution would be for us to implement. Bree, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Even though we've kind of identified perhaps two of these styles, they will start to blend into each other, right? I can think back to some of my hospitality days where I was much more part of a focus group style where leadership was really in charge of taking the feedback and putting action, more so that HR people team, right? And it was a lot of work. And so I found myself wondering when initiatives were put in place, kind of wondering, you know, what was behind this, or why are we doing this? Am I missing something maybe, and why if this is a focus? And if we dove down to it, which we actually see a lot when I'm working with our listening clients, going into that communication side, and sometimes how a quick communication solution can actually fill the gap for other initiatives that you're working on. And be more impactful with change, engagement, and culture, and even empowerment. I think that's the biggest thing that we see with having a culture committee is really empowering your team to feel a part of the organization, being a part of that solution, which will then help drive, and sometimes for some of you maybe, identify your culture, right? What's going to set you apart as a place to work, as a place to stay, and as a place to continually to talk about what you're doing there. So I love hearing about that blending, and oftentimes that's going to happen as well. So now that we've dove in a little bit to these different styles, of course, we'd love to hear from you and what you think maybe you're existing for half of the attendees here. What is your existing style? Or if you're looking to build one, what do you think you would focus on? Is that more of a focus group, more of that grassroots? Do you see a blended element working? Or are you kind of on your own in that tiger team where you come together as a group when you have specific action or task to complete? So we'll let you complete that poll and we'll take a look at that. And again, every organization's a little bit different, their makeup, their time, and their resources, and you may shift between those two as your organization evolves and moves on. Awesome.
Ooh.
So we see these results here, a big blended component.
Love
And
to
then
see
about,
that.
yeah, even split across kind of more of that focused versus grassroots, and even some evolution there in the Tiger team.
Awesome. Great to see that. Hey, Bree, we're hitting the nail on the head for the most part.
Yeah, a good blending of all of them, right? So
Yeah.
And I think no matter what we're doing, right, within those committees, we know it's important to take action. A lot of times we recommend, and you'll probably hear this, is don't ask feedback on something that you can't take action on, because it can be more detrimental if you ask about something and people give input, and then you actually, your hands are tied, resources are limited, and you can't do anything to it. So now that we've got this great feedback and we've identified where we're going to be able to put time, energy, and resources, we're going to take action. And in order to do that effectively, we've really got to close the feedback loop and communicate out to the rest of the team what we're working on, because in each element that we've talked about, each style, it's still just a small subset of your organization. And while you guys are going on all cylinders, we can't forget that not everyone else has received the feedback. So this is going to mirror a lot of what style you have. You know, this frequency of reporting back out could be monthly to quarterly. We do recommend that this first kind of communication of what you're working on is a more structured process. So it should be shared back at an all hands meeting, in addition to an email, or even an email could just be best. And while we're sharing this information out, we're going to talk about some of the highlights of the feedback and the responses we've received, and why the organization or even the culture committee is caring about this, right? What is the impact that this is having on the team to help drive a goal, to drive connection, collaboration, sales growth, retention, development, effective management, right? We've got to tie that purpose back. And as we're planning the action, we want to list out just a little bit of what some of that action looks like and how long it can take. We want to be mindful of setting those expectations when we're communicating back out, so that we're not leaving employees and the rest of the team hanging on what we're working on, and it helps add a little bit of accountability for those that are taking the lead. We also want to be mindful that some of the actions you take might be for the entire organization, or those may look a little different for each team, even manager and the employee, or even based on your location. And finally, don't forget to measure the growth or the results from that initiative, right? How do you know if it's going to be successful if you don't, after putting action into place, if you don't set a goal, how are you going to measure that? So make sure we're doing that and continuously asking for feedback. And as Corey goes into this, you know, ultimately, it's all about creating transparency, communication, collaboration to make sure that you keep that momentum going as we're reviewing different initiatives and results.
Yep, 100%. Communicating back and really closing that feedback loop is one of the most impactful actions that you can do, especially as a culture committee. And while we did focus on, action, right? What are we going to fix from this? It's also really important to communicate back what you won't work on. We've had to do this a couple of times as well with our own internal culture committees. We've seen the feedback get brought up about different areas that we simply will not work on right now, and simply areas that we cannot impact change on. And we'll be very transparent about that. Hey, we've seen this data, we see the feedback, we see your responses. Right now, there's nothing we can do about that. However, that is on our list of projects, and we'll reassess this in the next quarter. And so closing that loop is also very important as well, because you don't want people to be left saying, hey, I left you a great bit of feedback here, but nobody reached out and nobody told me anything about this, so I'm gone. And that's where restarting the loop really matters as well. Okay. Part of that as well. So not only closing the loop for folks that you won't work on, going back to closing the loop on things that we will work on. Here's a quick example of how we've done that in the past. So a sample shareback communication at our all hands meeting for Tiny Pulse, as you see there in our very old logo. Wow. Our all hands meeting there. As a culture committee member, one of us would have been up to share a little bit more during our all hands meeting about what we saw. We go over the data really quickly, saying as summarized, this is what we saw from our response rate, about 88%. So we know that this is good data here. Most of us have heard from you, and almost all of the business units are represented. Of that data, of that feedback, here are some of the themes that we're noticing. A lot of uncertainty, expressed concerns about our change, about the product changes, lots of updates going on in the industry that we are not really sure about if we can yet match. There's a lot of excitement, though, around those opportunities, as well as our merger. You get to see a little bit into our Tiny Pulse history here as well. And then lastly, the one theme that we did notice was that it was disappointed from our employee base that we had asked a repeat question again, seemingly too quickly. So knowing that we had some themes here that we were willing to address, and that we had some things here that we were not really going to touch, really the survey schedule being one of those, we then went into a discussion around the uncertainty and excited themes, and then bubbled up our concerns and our leadership who was overseeing the survey strategy there, saying that, hey, maybe we should hold off on a quarter for asking the happiness question there. Two different areas of the two different styles that we've covered today, the focus group and the grassroots style. This slide here, talking about the uncertainty and the excitement, was much more of the sort of grassroots style of how the culture committee was communicating back out to our organization. There were also areas where leadership leaned on us as well to understand some of that focus group behaviors, to really understand what they need to do as a business and to make those choices moving forward. What I think of specifically is in regards to our response to the COVID-19 pandemic and following up the COVID-19 pandemic, our return to work plan. Leadership really wanted to get us back into the office. However, being the feedback and engagement company that we are, we knew that we needed to ask questions first. And so a survey was sent out about the return to work plan, which we gathered a lot of the results. Leadership, gathered a lot of the results, aggregated that feedback, and really started to understand where do we land as an employee base in returning to work, and what would be the most agreeable solution for the most folks here. So embodying more of that focus group style, leadership came to us during our joint meeting and presented, hey, this is some of the things that we're seeing with return to work. Do we think that this will be as successful as possible? We gave some feedback there, but for the most part, leadership knew what needed to get done. And so during this all hands meeting, we as the culture committee were able to share out as well, in partnership with HR, our return to work plan, our phased return to work plan. So there are a lot of different opportunities to share, and also a clear example here of the blending of two strategies for a culture committee. But like we said, a lot of different things that culture committees can share about, right, Bree?
Yeah, what I love about these, I was actually part of the team with that phased return to work, is that sometimes we have to also ask really hard questions and dive in, right, to see how it's going to impact. And what I loved about this is we not only had in-office employees, but we had remote employees. And so you also, while one initiative might be company-based, this was a perfect example of how do we be mindful of those different environments, yet be very strategic on how we're going to come at this together. And so, yes, that blended approach, I think it allows to have really authentic conversations in either approach. And to be respectful on that feedback that we're getting, right? Because ultimately, it's about improving the team and the engagement in the workplace. And yes, not everyone's going to be agreeable on the action moving forward. And we just have to be mindful, though, of how that's being communicated back out. And I thought they did a great job in taking the time to present that and clearly sharing that feedback in a meaningful way. And as we speak about meaningful way, don't forget that your employees are receiving communication very differently. You might have some people that are very email driven. They're looking at that a little bit more involved or reactive to maybe a company newsletter. We know that some people are looking more one-on-one. They like small groups. So at a high level, when we're sharing this first feedback and action plans, while we recommend an all hands or an email, make sure that you're following up in different ways. So that can be, through fun graphics or visual effects in a company newsletter. Obviously, one-on-ones could have more impact, right? Someone may not feel comfortable asking questions or getting clarification on something with a larger team. So making sure as a leader, or even if you're combining teams, that you're giving space for those conversations to be had to make sure understanding and connection is being made. Because sometimes a goal might be presented with action items and you're kind of wondering, how is this going to affect me? How am I going to impact this? And if we're not making those connections effectively and timely, we can have some disconnect. So don't be afraid to get too down in it. And then also, we know with all the different channels out there, Slack and Teams, those can be great ways to connect with people that are living in there most of the time, making sure the data is in that feedback, that loop is being closed. So, and we put creative. We know a lot of you may have internal sites. You might be using a SharePoint site, making sure you may be back to the office. Use those break rooms, right, to communicate what initiatives you are on, and then celebrate the success, achieving those goals, setting new plans, new tools into place, right, ways to better help the team. Don't forget that that's also part of closing that feedback loop, is to celebrate the wins.
And now into a little bit more about the evolution of the culture committees. We've gone over really, the who, what, where, when, why, and how of these sort of most generic workflow of a culture committee to review and discuss what's going to be the most helpful things, and then act on how we can then grow the culture. But now we'll go into a little bit more about how that evolves and what other sort of tasks culture committees can embody. I'll be using Tiny Pulse really as the sort of story vehicle to move forward into the evolution of the next culture committee there. When I started with our culture committee at Tiny Pulse, it very much was that V1 version of culture committee, right? Just base responsibilities of reviewing the feedback and suggestions that were coming in to then identify those issues, create and brainstorm some engagement initiatives to then solve for those issues, and then continue to just be a team advocate for my other folks on sales to then, bubble up any sort of issues or things that they're saying to me, to have then me advocate for them at the culture committee table there. Over a few years, we start to handle different issues, thinking of that second bullet point, right? Implementing different engagement initiatives. We get to see some of those as short-term. However, when we see the immense success of those short-term initiatives and the continued love and respect from the employees for those initiatives, we start to understand that those should become regular workflows for our culture committee as well. And so when I think about how our culture committee evolved, a lot of it came from offshoots of those main responsibilities. So when we are implementing engagement initiatives, I think specifically to two as good examples here. The first being Good Times Cheers Selector Initiative. We had a lot of feedback, more responses around this. And we saw a dwindling score on our recognition and sort of appreciation that employees felt internally. After doing some more ad hoc research from our anecdotal evidence, reaching out to different team members, we really started to understand that people don't feel like they were celebrated when they were doing a job well done. And which was really odd to us because we saw a lot of those Cheers for Peers. If you are a Linemade listening user, you know that Cheers for Peers is our recognition tool. Cheers for Peers, we saw a lot of those cheers going around, being sent. And so what we then decided to do was that at our all hands meeting, when we're looking to close that feedback loop about what we're also implementing in regards to a solution, we also wanted to start that meeting off with a little bit of positivity. So over that period of time since our last meeting, we then aggregated all of the cheers that were sent internally to our other teammates, and then highlighted 3 that were really amazing. And we tied those back to our company values as well. So whether it be delighting customers or leading solutions, things like that, we would highlight certain cheers that were given to other folks to then pick one that was the best, most value-oriented cheers that we noticed. And those 2 people, the sender and the receiver, would get a nice gift card to go out and get a lunch or a coffee. That was very much back in the quote unquote old days, right? When we were all in office together, but we still very much embody that church selector as well. And we have very public recognition programs now because of that. And that is something that was started from an engagement initiative that has then become a part of our actual living culture. Same thing with Good Times Crew. And that we had received a lot of feedback and suggestions around the lack of sort of community building events. We had a quarterly community service event, and that was all well and good, and everyone enjoyed that. But we had a lot more suggestions around, hey, why don't we have anything that's just for us, just for fun, for us to get to know our people, our company, our leaders better. And interestingly enough, very early on in the Tiny Pulse days, there was a old crew. They did not like the name committee, which was odd to me. And so they called themselves the Good Time Crew. And really all it was they looked to leadership to give them budget to plan some fun events. And so we revitalized that in our new Tiny Pulse organization. And so we were able to create that as sort of a second responsibility for Culture Committee. Culture Committee took that on very willingly and excitingly, and I was one of the lead members of the Good Times Crew. That was probably one of my most fun memories with Culture Committee in creating monthly and quarterly events that were just focused on building good times for our people. We did everything from potlucks to hot wings interviews. If you're familiar with the Hot Ones YouTube channel, we did that with our leaders and any new execs that joined as well. But that was supposed to be a short-term initiative that ended up becoming one of our ongoing Culture Committee responsibilities that people just came to know and love. Bree actually was invited as a Good Times Crew member, I think before she was even on the Culture Committee. But yeah, that was those are two really great examples for us in things that were created from feedback that had become now our evolution of our Culture Committee and is part of our Culture Committee Code of Conduct.
Yeah, Corey, I love to hear that because you're right. I came on when these were already established. And so it was all I knew, assuming this was always as it had been, not knowing that these were new initiatives that had been brought up through feedback and discussion and collaboration. But what I could tell you was, man, I had so many thoughts of, oh, I wish this old job had this or this did that. So it did have an impact. I loved being a part of all of that, to share my ideas or even be part of the fun in the communication and the cross collaboration to feel empowered and have an impact on how I could help the team be better, right? And that's really where you'll see people grow. It's not always a growth up. A lot of times people just want to grow out, right? They're happy with what they're doing. They're experts at what they're doing, but how do they now grow more within the organization? So I think another cool part of this evolution, which we've talked a little bit about with the blending, is how this kind of might go to more of a think tank, right? So we had shared some of the success with Big Red Rooster Flow and their culture committees. And after talking with Kathy, I actually learned they had been a Limeade Listening, formerly Tiny Pulse, a client for quite some time, and it had been recommended by their customer success manager to perhaps look at forming a committee to help with reviewing these results, helping Kathy really understand what impact it can have in those solutions. And, lucky for Kathy and her team, she was empowered by her senior executive team to really run with this. They knew culture was important. They knew involving their team and listening was important. And so run with this and let's make this be what we want it to be. And in the beginning, it was very focused on these results. What can we do? How do we impact? How do we change processes and procedures to be better for our team to be more effective at what they do? But over the years, it has really changed. And one thing that she highlighted was it has become more of this think tank. Now, while Kathy might bring some targeted items to talk about, some more of that tiger team concept, it's really it's a fostering of a community, and they meet when they need to meet. It's not just let's meet because we have this committee. They really want to be intentional about where they're spending their time and their energy and resources to impact the rest of the Rooster team. So I loved hearing how, hey, we were a little bit more structured. Now we're becoming a little bit more independent. Once we've improved a process, we're putting that in, similar to Tiny Pulse, right? It's becoming a part of our culture and our organization. And now we're still utilizing that and still recommending or nominating committee members to be a part of that moving forward. And it's really helped create this sense of community and collaboration. So I love to hear how these are evolving, and hopefully yours will evolve too after today's discussion, or even on some of the different initiatives you're working on. And I think, oh yeah, go ahead.
No, just going into the next
Here
slide.
we go. Yeah, awesome. So, man, everything we talked about today, we want to be mindful too. It's been a lot of reactive, right? We've gotten feedback. What are we going to do? But one of the sweet spots that we've started to highlight on is when you can balance that reactive in understanding where there's opportunity to be proactive, and what can we focus on further amplifying or highlighting, recognizing, right? Peeling back those onion layers to uncover some really different areas of focus, right? And some of them might be hard conversation or hard topics to tackle, but the impact can be very high on your team's engagement and culture and existence at the organization, right? That work-life integration. So don't be afraid to dive deeper. I know Corey gave a great example of how the data said one thing, but as we dove into it, we understand a little bit more, right? We can't boil the ocean. So making sure we're focusing on those high impact areas and where we can allocate resources for action. And, one of the things that we see here happening at Limeade is diving into one of those deeper topics, like managing stress and anxiety, right? Giving extra time to understand what the team really needs to balance that work-life integration, leading down to more mental health, communication, collaboration, right? We know that some of these initiatives will have action items that overlap as well. And I just love seeing that the evolution of really what those focuses look like too. Corey, what are your thoughts here and how some of these initiatives evolve?
Yeah, evolution, I think, is probably the best word for it, right? Because you get to see, you learn something and then you experience it, and then something about what you're focusing on or your actions gets changed one way or the other, right? When we look at the feedback that we were receiving, whether it be from suggestions or even survey responses, we start to think, oh, maybe it's just based what they're saying, right? But then as we've continued that culture committee workflow, and we get to build up a sort of sense of the culture, and really, what is our organization really calling for right now as well? And so we get to see with the more grassroots style, where employee would actually lead the culture. How would we actually create this in our image there as well? That leads into that third one there as well, because right now we're hearing a lot more conversations of people looking to start or reorganize or recreate or revitalize their culture. In the last couple of years, we've experienced so many different things that have really shifted the foundations of whatever you want to call it, whether it be culture, business, life, etc. And now has been a great period of time after some, tumultuous times during the work with workers. That is a good time to sort of restart our culture and figure out, what do we want to do and what do we want to be defined as coming out of this? And so don't be afraid to dive in, and don't be afraid to start new sometimes as well with creating a culture. And if you do want to go down that journey, we'd be happy to discuss that with you as well. So you can reach out to your customer success member or support at Tiny Pulse to dive deeper into exactly how you can do that with Limeade Listening.
Awesome. Thanks, Corey. Well, hopefully that time flew by like it did for us, for all of you. We've come to the question and answer time. We do have a couple of moments. So if you have questions, go ahead and populate those in. either in the chat or the Q&A. As a reminder, you'll get a recording of this as well as the deck. It will also be available on demand. So thank you all for joining us today and sharing. I'm not seeing any questions come in at the moment, as Corey mentioned, as well, that we are available. Your customer success manager is available. I do see one question about offer guidance on how to create a diversity committee. Corey, do you want to take that one and then I can give some suggestions?
Currently we don't have any explicit recommendations on how to create a diversity committee, but that's something that we'd be able to discuss more in regards to a survey strategy to help you understand really what your people are asking for in regards to diversity. Because the same thing with the sort of focus group style, right? Of someone coming down and saying, hey, I think we need to do this. Well, we want to get a little bit more data around that first. Then we would then make a recommendation on that. However, as for the same sort of level of resources and walkthrough that we've gone through today on how to create a culture committee, we don't have anything like that currently for diversity committees.
And Corey could not have said it better. So yeah, thanks for that insight. And some of this you might be able to utilize to help with that. Wonderful. Looks like we had some other questions, but those had been answered in there. So again, just to call some of those out, if you missed part one, it is available on demand as well as that deck there. So we can definitely reach out to us. We can point you in that right direction. Both of these webinars will live on our website so that you can go and play back. They'll be under the resources tab. So a great follow-up for you there.
Shelley's asked a really great question in here as well, of how do you solve for culture committee burnout? Do you want to take a stab at that first, Bree, or should I?
So so probably with this, what we would recommend, and we alluded to this a little bit more on the grassroots side, but is kind of having a term length. I think one experience that I can share being on the culture committee is I knew up front that we did a 6-month schedule, I guess. So for this very reason, right? We know that it's a volunteer role. We were meeting monthly. There's also additional pre and prep work and presentation that was going into it. So by defining kind of the length of service on the culture committee, I think was very helpful in preventing burnout while also allowing others to be involved and give solutions and resources, right? You may have some people that find it very passionate to be a part of that process and want to stay on. On an executive level, what we would recommend is a lot of times it does fall on that HR people team to be the connection, right? So you might be on it all the time every year. If you have the opportunity to have other HR members lead that portion of it, or even challenge some of those executive committee members, right, to be involved, because it also fosters these new relationships that will build community within the organization. But ultimately, I think it's good to put a time structure around it so that there's movement and revolving of resources. Corey, do you have anything to add?
Totally agree that, setting up term lengths is going to be a great way to get ahead of that burnout as well. But if you are in a small organization, you can't really get around that sometimes, right? Where there's only going to be X amount of people that will always want to take part in that. At that point, then you need to then really assess, right, what's going on and what we can do to even address that sort of level of burnout, because sometimes there might not be things you can do. For us specifically at Tiny Pulse, when we were Tiny Pulse, we had a big focus on recognition, right? And so we knew that recognition was very much needed from our organization, us culture committee members being a part of the organization. We also had that same sort of need as well. So then we not necessarily looped into explicit culture committee awards, but there were end of year awards for sort of culture champions. And that's really where a lot of the culture committee members got their tank refilled, right? That sort of public recognition of, hey, we see you folks doing this sort of thankless job sometimes of reviewing the feedback, really shoveling through the mud to find out what's going to be the most impactful thing for us and then making that happen. And so those end of year awards, or even, quarterly, do a lot, especially for those kinds of people that would like to, volunteer for our culture committees like that. And so recognition goes a long way, but I'd say the easiest sort of recommendation for you would just to be set up some term lengths. Great question though. Thanks, Shelley.
Awesome. It looks like we have just a couple more minutes. So why don't we do this? You didn't think you'd get a gift. We're going to give you the gift of 3 minutes, hopefully before your next meeting. Please go take a wellness break. Go stand outside, take the fresh air, get a little snack if you need to, recharge for the afternoon. We appreciate you being here with us. Corey, thank you for not only this one, but the first webinar. It's always a pleasure to collaborate with you. I love working with you. And Kimmy, our behind the scenes webinar and marketing specialist, we appreciate all of your support as well. So thank you to everyone. Corey, any closing remarks?
No closing remarks. We're just so excited to see you folks hopefully implement if you haven't already one. And if you do have one, we'd love to hear some of the evolution that you're taking, or even if maybe we got it a little wrong on the styles. Maybe you've got a third style that you would say we would implement. We'd love to hear anything about this, because culture committees, much like engagement, is a continuously growing sort of term, right? And so we'd love to see where you take it there. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
All right. Cheers to happier employees.